In the 90s, everyone I knew had some kind of Charlotte Hornets paraphernalia. Jersey, shirt, jacket, hat. They were new, it was fresh, the name was different, but there was something about those colors, purple and teal, that came to define the era of the 90s, becoming the unofficial colors of the decade. What was it about these colors? How did this happen? And when it comes to pop culture, how do trends catch on? Let's play a memory. So it feels like when we look back in history, each decade has sort of these iconic moments or these things that we remember them by that are fairly accepted widely. And I look at the 90s, which is an era where you and I grew up in, similarly, but I feel like there's an element of something that was widespread in the 90s, yet gets largely overlooked, is the rise of these two colors, teal and purple.
If I were to brand the 90s as like a company,
Yeah.
like without a doubt, these would be the two colors, purple and teal. It was such a subtle thing, and I think that this happens often in culture, that we were never thinking as kids, I want something purple, I want something teal. It was just kind of everywhere, but all the places that it existed were so kind of in the background. It was almost like a visual soundtrack, if you will, for the decade.
Yeah.
That it's not until now that we're adults, decades removed from it, that it's like so blaringly obvious that those were the two.
So the interesting thing to me is what was the big bang moment for these two colors? And for us, it starts with the advent of an expansion NBA franchise in 1988, so a couple of years before the decade of the 90s began, which were the Charlotte Hornets. And what was unique about this franchise at the time is, a lot of times colors patterns are chosen for certain things, and they're sort of symbolic of what they're coming into, things that are already in existence, colors that are reflective of the cities where they are or whatever. And this was a completely different outside the box concept for a design choice. And a lot of it kind of was formulated directly on the individual who designed the uniforms, which is a very famous fashion designer, American fashion designer named Alexander Julian.
Is this a typical thing that a fashion designer would be the one to design sports uniforms, or do most teams, to your knowledge, have like kind of like an internal team that would come up with this? Because this was an expansion team, so this is a completely new. All of this is like new city, new team, new concept.
Yeah, I think a lot of times there's logos that are designed. Sometimes I've heard stories that they would hold a logo design contest. Colors might be picked by the individual who owns the franchise. There's a variety of ways that this could be done, but I think this was unique because of the fact that it was a well-known fashion designer in the world, not just in the United States, that was doing this.
This whole idea that they got Alexander Julian to be the one to design these uniforms, I think, is definitely an ingredient in what made these colors and everything that came after this so impactful. Like the beginning of this story is so different than any other story about any other sports franchise.
So Alexander Julian was an American fashion designer born in North Carolina in 1948. He had his own clothing store while he was in college at the University of North Carolina called Alexander's Ambition, and he designed his own fabric, a textile, Kauai colors, which was a linen, by age 30, a first in the American fashion industry. and that cloth is now at the Smithsonian. He's known best for his color and bringing color to modern American menswear. He also incorporated his famous Argyle pattern into the University of North Carolina men's basketball uniforms. He also launched a furniture line in 1994 modeled off of his clothing line and has designed movie costumes and menswear for TV shows. So these uniforms were unveiled in 1988 by the Hornets, and they're the first uniforms in professional sports to pair teal and purple. As someone who's in design, immediately, what do you feel when you see those colors?
I mean, obviously, I think 90s now,
Yeah.
but I keep trying to put myself back in the late 80s where we've had all these other sports franchises with, colors like red and blue and green. I mean, like this.
Traditional colors.
Exactly. And this is something that has never been done before. And I know that, the Yankees have like their famous, the pinstripes, but Alexander Julian did something really interesting with not only the colors, but he did this kind of like pleat pattern, which when I saw it, when I came across it, I was thinking, okay, you can definitely see this connection of him being in designing menswear because he essentially took this kind of more like fancy thing and incorporated it into the Hornets uniforms, which is something that again that had never been done before.
Yeah, the shorts having pleats, usually athletic shorts are pretty straight faced, forward faced. That element of design I think was unique, and I think this is kind of building the case for when we're talking about why things catch on, which we'll ultimately get to a little later in the episode. I think these are the little nuanced pieces of things that are memorable that make some of the other elements of the total design so much more long lasting. I mean, the jersey also, there were jerseys that had vertical stripes on them, that pinstripes on them. But what was interesting is that while the Hornets jerseys had the vertical stripes, the green and purple striping, the shorts didn't have them. The shorts were, like we said, they had pleats, but the shorts didn't have them. So you had this vertical stripe on top, which is very consistent with some of his fashion design, men's fashion design work at the time, but the shorts did not have them. So all of these, I felt like little nuances to these uniforms when you're trying to connect dots as to why did these two colors become such a big thing over the course of 10 years. You have to look at, I think, some of the other elements of what went into the design to ultimately get why was this such a long lasting and impactful design.
All of his design choices were so far reaching, not only in making these two colors the prominent colors of the 90s, but also in everything that happened in sports apparel in the years after this. I think a lot of times in design, we can kind of need permission to see someone doing something that's different before we feel like we can pitch something or introduce something, to a brand or to a company that we're working with. And I feel like there was kind of this explosion after this where we were seeing all, not only this color replicated in other sports teams, but also in, if you think about the way that we see sports today, like the amount of alternate jerseys that exist, the having, black instead of white. And I think Alexander Julian is responsible for all of that happening.
Yeah, and it caught on quickly. It helped that those Hornets teams in the 90s were pretty competitive and they had some really interesting great players, but like also interesting characters on them, from Alonzo Mourning to Larry Johnson to Muggsy Bogues to Glenn Rice. There were some players that really resonated with fans of the NBA in the 90s. So I think that also has something to do with it. You have this brand new professional team and you have these very well-known stars who were coming into that organization that were, wearing these colors and these uniforms. I think that has a lot to do with it catching on, but it was so powerful, to your point, that you started to see these colors start to get replicated around the sports world. So of the 22 new or renamed teams in the big four pro leagues, so that would be Major League Baseball, the National Football League, the National Basketball Association, and the National Hockey League. Of the 22 new or renamed teams, 11 of them in the 90s used teal and or purple as their colors. So this is the Florida Marlins, the Colorado Rockies, the Arizona Diamondbacks, who use both. The Tampa Bay Devil Rays, the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Baltimore Ravens, the Toronto Raptors, the Vancouver Grizzlies. Those were two NBA teams that came into the league in 1995. One went purple, one went teal. Can't tell me that that doesn't have something to do with the popularity of the Hornets coming into the league. But the San Jose Sharks, the Mighty Ducks, the Phoenix Coyotes, it birthed an entire generation in the sports world of teal, purple, or both. And I don't think we've ever seen anything like this ever in the history of sports.
No, this has definitely never happened again. And like you said, if anything, it's kind of gone the opposite. Like there are so many variations now that we've kind of like lost, kind of with this consistency that we saw in the 90s. But I love that you kind of brought up that the Hornets were this kind of like young, I don't know if the players were young, but like
Yeah.
this cool team. It was like I think if anything, like they were trendy. It was like trendy to be a Hornets fan or to be associated with them. And I mean, I think there's a reason that all of these other teams decided to copy what they were doing. But I want to talk about how this extended off of the court. I mean, obviously the players were all wearing this stuff, but I feel like there is one prominent piece of apparel where this showed up in my life as a kid. And we've talked about this before. You and I have talked about this before. So I know it was true for you as well. And I'm curious, like the audience in different parts of the country, if this rang true everywhere.
In the 90s, it's no surprise starter jackets were a huge piece of apparel for people. You either had your favorite team or you had a popular team. I mean, it was really popular to see Dallas Cowboy starter jackets, San Francisco 49ers starter jackets, teams that dominated in the 90s, Chicago Bulls starter jackets for sure. But everybody felt like, at least a good amount of kids that I grew up with, and I'm sure you too, had a starter jacket. But what was also very evident is while people had their favorite team or the dominant teams, there was a large population of kids who walked around with Charlotte Hornets starter jackets. And it's not because they were cheering them on a nightly basis, but it was something that caught on. And I think if you look at a lot of memes that you see on Instagram accounts that throw back to the 90s, you'll see that, like, why were starter jackets so popular back then, and why did everybody else have a Charlotte Hornets one? Like, why was that the most popular one? Those colors transformed society. They transformed culture, and they really came to define culture as well. I had 3 Charlotte Hornets jerseys growing up, and I was not a Charlotte Hornets fan, but there was just something about that teal. They introduced a purple version of the jersey a few years after they became a franchise, and I had to have that. It was just something about those two colors that started to embed themselves, I think, in society, and it was a way for kids to express that those colors were accepted. That was the way for them to sort of display that through their apparel, and certainly through that starter jacket trend.
Feels like obvious, like I shouldn't need to say this, but all of this was before social media. So think about, obviously it's so easy for trends to, spark and spread today, but this was in a time where in the early 90s where we weren't on computers, we weren't using the internet, but yet something like this still had the power to catch on. Colors are something that are so accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, I know that you mentioned you were a kid, you were a sports fan, so obviously you were gravitating towards buying the actual apparel, but I think it's interesting that these colors kind of started to pop up everywhere, and I think that we were, as kids, naturally gravitated toward it because we wanted to be part of something. I mean, it's kind of like a tribe
Right.
thing. Like we were all on the team teal and purple in the
Right.
90s.
And it's not something that I feel like do you feel like you see that today when trends begin, whether it's fashion or otherwise? I don't feel like you see the shelf life as much as you did. I mean, these two colors had a pretty much a decade run. That's unheard of in the era that we live in now. And I'm not sure I can think of anything that actually has of any kind of trend that's remotely come close to that.
No, not at all. I mean, I think it's a little bit harder to kind of identify that in decades that we're not so far removed from yet. So to be able to say like, okay, what were the colors in the 2010s?
Right.
Maybe I can make an argument maybe for millennial pink, but outside of that, even when I think about decades, like, we can think about maybe like the 60s and 70s being more like browns and yellows, but like to be able to call out these two very specific colors and then being together, I can't say that for any other decade, even prior to the
Right.
90s.
Right. And I think even if you go beyond colors, like if you think about what we would call as trends of the era that we live in now, like the one that's coming to mind immediately is the Stanley Cups that took the world by storm, maybe let's just for argument's sake within the last 2 years or so. It hit immediately and everybody had them and every store had them and the price was all out of control and people didn't care and they were buying this color and that color. And now it feels like, a year later or 6 months later, not that you don't necessarily see them, but the volume of everything kind of dies down. People have them. They don't necessarily, they move on to the next thing that's coming through. This unique time almost feels like it was one of the last points in our society where something big happened and it caught on and it was sustainable for a while and nobody found that annoying. Nobody called it out and was like, oh, enough of this. And I think a lot of it does have to do with, even though there was a lot of exposure of it, there wasn't a place to talk about it and there wasn't a place to dissect it. So it doesn't necessarily have that sort of overdone feeling to it.
I think it was also just like it was our reality. We weren't
Right.
we weren't looking at each other through screens and seeing this, kind of like a movie version of someone else's life and saying, I want something like that, like, which I think is how the Stanley Cups caught on. We were just, we were kids and we were hanging out with our friends and they're wearing something cool. So like we want to look like them. We want to, be accepted by them. And I think that you're spot on in your assessment that the 90s were the last decade where something like that could happen, where it wasn't just widespread. It was deep and it went long. It really spans the entire decade. I think a couple of the sports teams that you mentioned, what do you think was the last what was the last team that kind of like came out with these colors? And when was
Um,
that?
of the combined purple and teal, the Diamondbacks really were the last team that I think debuted purple and teal, and that was 1998. Now, that to me is very, yes, it's capitalizing on popular colors of the decade, but I also think that teal and purple is very, like we talked about at the top of the episode, is very much associated with the Southwest, specifically teal. So that makes sense. What's interesting to me is not 7, 8 years later, they changed their color to more of a deep red and black, completely abandoning teal and purple. But I believe that was the last franchise that I can remember who did both, who debuted both colors. But again, you had franchises all after 1988 that we mentioned before, having some element of teal or purple, because I think those were just the dominant colors and they knew that those uniforms and that color palette would sell.
Yeah, I mean, I love how that fits so squarely. The Hornets, was it 1988 that those were debuted?
Yep. Yep.
So it like exactly like a 10-year span between this introduction of this color palette and then, like the last team to come out with the two of them together.
But you saw this also in other aspects of pop culture. When we talk about how trends catch on, and obviously we're talking about this from a sports lens, but if you look, I mean, you didn't have to go far in the 90s, I think, to have exposure to these colors in different areas. I think about food courts in malls, and that was an area where, like, I mean, like you talk about like remember those that like it was almost like a glass type wall that was like a dividing well it's like I think about Saved by the Bell, like that sort of like in the restaurant there, like that side of layup. But food courts and malls and whatever it is were littered with purple and teal colors. When we think about the heyday of malls being like, the late 80s and really into the 90s, that really capitalized on that moment. Like those, when I think about the areas that inherited those, like malls are one of the first ones that, that comes to mind.
Absolutely. And not that I completely associate this with like being in the mall, but do you remember like going to Taco Bell's in the 90s?
Yeah.
I mean, it again, like an advertisement for these colors
Yeah.
everywhere on the seats. Those, like, I felt like there was this kind of like three stripe pattern, if I'm
Yep.
remembering correctly.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it was just like a teal and purple playground.
Yep. I feel like the seats in food courts were all either
Yes.
teal or purple. The padding on the chairs, all of that, felt like that was, it was just something that started to emerge, I think, because people responded to it. People were drawn to that. And I think designers noticed that. They knew people would kind of get pulled in. The craze in the late 90s of IMAX. Did you have an iMac?
I didn't. My college roommate did, but
Okay.
I wasn't cool enough yet. But I think I probably would have picked. I felt like the teal was kind of the front runner. Like
Yeah.
if we saw ads where they showed all the different, because they have multicolors beyond teal and purple, but I feel like the teal was kind of like the captain of the IMAX.
Yeah. I think that's also, I remember I had a Spanish teacher who had an iMac in her classroom, and that was that she had a purple back to it. But it was, those are the two ones that I remember the most. I think that influx of colors when it comes to computers, specifically those two areas, that definitely was a thing.
How about in movies and TV shows? Because I feel like this was a spot where it was a little bit more subtle, but there's one movie that was very important to me as a young, 6, 7 year old when it came out, The Little Mermaid. I
Mm,
mean, when I think of that movie, I think of that teal tail, but then also purple kind of being like the secondary color to that. And what's interesting is like that movie didn't come out. I think it may have come out in '89. So like really right around the time when this Hornets, you know, the Hornets were coming onto the scene. So that's one that I don't know if that was just a happy accident or if there was enough time in there that they may have been influenced by it.
you had talked before about like the starter jackets being kind of this identifiable fashion piece that was representative of those colors. But there's another item that I always think about with these two colors that were associated with it. And it's one that felt like once the clock turned to the year 2000, we never saw them anymore. And that was, if you remember Solo's purple teal, it's kind of like a jazz pattern from their paper cups and plates. They had this little purple and teal jagged slanty kind of design to it, almost like a wavy kind of design to it. If the uniforms were the representation of it, this was the more pop culture kind of like representation of those two colors in everyday use.
I love how you were kind of like struggling a little bit to describe
Yeah,
exactly
it's an
because
indescribable pattern. Like it doesn't have something where you're like, you see that check? It doesn't.
and I mean the reason I think that that's so funny is because yet at the same time, we're going to put a visual of this up on the screen. Anyone from our decade would see that this thing that does not have a name. It's really like it's more of like a concept. I mean,
Yeah.
yes, it was on drinking cups. It was also I'm picturing it kind of like on maybe like takeout containers
Yep.
as well, like
Yep.
anything that was kind of like a cylinder. And anyone our age from our generation would be like, of course I know what that is. Like they would know someone in their family.
Right. I remember as a kid, I had gotten I think it was a giveaway at a fast food restaurant. It might have been McDonald's or something like that, but it was around the time that The Water Boy came out and with Adam Sandler. And if you're a card collector, and it was a football card of Bobby Boucher, but if you're a card collector, you'll know sometimes there are cards that has the photo of the person, and then embedded within the card is a piece of fabric from the uniform or something like that, and it's supposed to have additional value. So this giveaway card was a picture of Bobby Boucher in his uniform, and then where you would typically have a cutout of the fabric of the uniform, it was just a piece of the cup, the water cup, with that teal and purple pattern on it, because it was obviously the water boy. So like even the pop culture reach of those two colors in that era, and for it to be a daily part of life. I mean, like, it's not something where it's like, oh, those of you who have an iMac, or those of you who have seen The Little Mermaid, or those of you who happen to have Charlotte. I mean, this was the most ubiquitous representation of these colors, and probably that was the peak of it. That was the last hurrah of those colors, probably the last surviving aspect of all of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things that we didn't really have a choice. We weren't saying, I want to get these cups because everyone else is getting it. It was just kind of like the standard
That was it. That's
cup
what you had.
choice. Like
Right.
everyone had them, no matter where
Right.
you went, what restaurant, or getting them from the supermarket. And then I feel like then they were kind of gone. I mean,
Gone.
I think, have they? I mean, has there been
I
a
don't
like a
see them that
resurgence?
often. I don't feel like I've seen them. They could very well still be out there. Maybe that's a little bit of post research that we can do, but I don't feel like we have seen, as we were compiling, our list of purple and teal things that we remember. And we want you guys to share your remembrances, not just of these things that we're talking about, but other things that you might remember that have those two identifiable decade colors associated with them. I think this was the one that immediately we both said, remember those cups? Remember that pattern? Remember that
Just
plate?
the
Remember that, like,
cups.
right, bags, whatever. But like what people are talking, what I was talking about. And I think those of you who are listening know exactly what we're talking about. In our intro to this episode, the last question that we asked was, why do trends catch on? We've cited a whole slew of different examples, both from the 90s and outside of that decade in this episode, that have been noteworthy trends. Some have caught on for long periods of time, and some have flamed out, but they have had a moment. And it's that moment of contagiousness that I think we want to spend a little bit of time kind of parsing out here about why this is a thing and how we can sort of learn from this moment in history. Jonah Berger is an author, a well-known author who wrote a book a number of years ago called Contagious, and he outlines these areas of note that are reasons as to why things end up catching on. And he talks a little bit about how one of the elements of getting something to catch on is a social currency. And Michelle, you kind of got at this a little while ago, that it's all about people talking about things to make themselves look good rather than bad, right? So you're seeing these starter jackets or these things to make them feel like this is something that's going to get me somewhere as a kid in the 90s who might be in elementary school or middle school, who might be struggling to kind of catch on with a friend group or trying to make a name for themselves or whatever. And this is a way for me to get a foot in that door. If I look like everyone else does, this is going to be something that's going to help me fit in a little bit more.
Oh yeah. I mean, in the same way that we talked about, it was an easy decision for brands and for these new sports franchises to choose these colors because they knew that they were working. It's an easy decision for kids. It's an easy decision for parents to be able to say, okay, if I have to, my kid needs a new jacket, like I'm going to pick the one that all their friends
Right.
are wearing, because I don't want my kid to be like the one that doesn't fit in. I mean, I think that that's like an insecurity that stems from like adults to kids. So the people who are making the buying decisions, and then obviously like us as kids, we all, our generation specifically, I think was a generation that had more exposure to commercials than any other generation. Yeah. So like it was kind of a given that we were all gravitating towards these same things. And it was kind of like two things feeding each other. It was like these companies introducing these products and services and environments, like we talked about the mall and Taco Bell.
Yeah.
But then also us as, you know, kids and parents as consumers who were just gobbling it up.
100%. I think it's one of those things where when we can see other people doing something, we're more likely to want to imitate it. And you see this in many other aspects beyond just pop culture stuff. But oh gosh, I can recall being a kid, and it was like right before school started, and I needed jeans, and I was definitely one of those kids for a year who had like jeans that probably didn't fit him too well. And this was in the era where like baggier jeans in the 90s were starting to come into play, and mine were definitely a little bit tighter, and you could like, it was like an Urkel kind of situation where like you could see my socks. And I remember saying to my mom and dad, like, I need jeans. And they had taken me to buy jeans. And, you know, it was the era where like I'm going into the fitting room, and your mom is like waiting outside, and my dad's out there waiting for me to come out. And my dad says that after I had put the jeans on and I came out and I went back in, he goes, I could see right before the door closed, I looked in the mirror and I went, yes. Like, and it was this like, it was this moment of like just relief, because it was like, I'm going to fit in, and other people are doing this and I'm imitating that. And I understand that, you know, we don't want people copying everybody. You want to be your own individual, but there is an element of fitting in that, you know, is a part of, I think, contagious, that like you want to imitate something because you see other people doing it, and it has an impact on you from that social currency lens of, it's going to make me look good. The other piece of this that I think is worth kind of getting out on here is what it leads to for the power of stories. You know, and I want to go back to Alexander Julian and the selection. You know, he seems like somebody who took a lot of chances and a lot of bets and a lot of risks on himself, but also in his work, that it was going to pay off. And I think you have to do that if you want to make some element of an impact or change in culture. You know, we talked about this with the Hornets uniforms, that these were not colors that anybody had seen before on uniforms. And I think at first there was a little bit of like, you know, I think even though there's Kelly Tripucka, who was a player for the Hornets when they were in an expansion franchise, talked about like, yeah, it's a little weird to see purple and this, you know, like nobody really, you know, the buy-in wasn't immediate on this, right? But like, as you play the string out a little bit, the popularity that and the things that get remembered, I think that's what is part of what he might have been going for with this. Like, I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to pick these colors. I'm going to be true to myself and what I am about as a fashion designer. And oftentimes when you take that risk on something, the payoff, good or bad, the payoff is people remember it. It's not something that necessarily gets forgotten about. And that's the impact of stories. If you want to do something that's homogenized, that's the same, that's a recipe for people forgetting about things. But the stories, the narratives, the things that we've spent this episode talking about are all because of the risk that guy, that Alexander Julian, took, that led to all of these other things piggybacking it, but making them equally as memorable and as identifiable with an era. Michelle, this was fun. It was kind of cool to go back into our childhood and relive a moment. And I'm going to see if I can hop on eBay here in a minute and find me a cheap Charlotte Hornets jersey to have.